Welcome back to the Dormant Politics Podcast. My name is Justin Fisher.
I'm Austin Vertine.
And my name is Nolan Flaherty. And tonight we have a special guest with us. His name is Christopher Grady. He's a fellow classmate with us from OHS. I wanted to bring him on to this podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about institutionalized racism. And I think Chris has a lot to offer as a part of our podcast, as he has some personal experience with this topic. And it's actually a different perspective that he's going to be able to provide for us in this conversation. So I'd like to welcome Chris Grady to our podcast.
So, essentially, I really like Chris's perspective. If I'm not mistaken, you did grow up in Chicago, right?
No, I did not. I was born in the Chicagoland area, but I did not grow up in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's still an interesting perspective to have on the show. Well, personally, I think me and Austin would disagree on the idea of diversity of race. I think a lot of the viewers that are watching wouldn't really care to hear about institutional racism, police brutality from three white guys. So honestly, it's good to have Chris on the show, especially for a lot of our more leftist viewers that would essentially agree with Austin. But essentially, we're going to be tackling the idea that America's institutions of government are inherently racist. So the police force is biased, the Department of Justice is biased, and it favors white Americans. So Austin, what would you comment on that one?
Well, I would say that the way that you framed that, Justin, would be a little incorrect. I think when we're discussing whether there is institutionalized racism, I don't think there's a question of whether there is or there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I think that through our own history, through our own American history, this country was founded on the idea that one race was 3/5 of a human being in our Constitution. So there's an inherent bias in our system. And we thought after the Civil Rights Movement, I think a lot of Americans thought that this issue suddenly went away. But the issue is still real to this day, and it's pervasive throughout our whole country.
So, my view is essentially, America was founded on racism. I don't want to say it was founded on racism. I want to say there was elements of racism that went into the foundings of this country, right? Our founding fathers owned slaves. Slavery went all the way up until 1863. Civil Rights Act in 1964, right? Brown v. Board wasn't until 1954. We definitely see institutional racism up until the 60s, 64. My view isn't that America's history wasn't racist. My view is that America in 2018 isn't institutionally racist. So I think if we look at statistics of police brutality that are thrown in the media today, that we see a lot of narrative, right? We see day after day, narrative after narrative. We see an innocent black kid, unarmed, that was killed by police, right? And it's this narrative that's pushed by the left, and we see this rift that's driven between black Americans and police officers. And I that rift does exist, right? I feel like black Americans feel this rift between their community and police officers, but I don't think that the claims have any statistical merit. Anyway, I feel like you would be the best to comment on the rift between black Americans and police officers today in 2018.
All right, so this goes back to the conversation I had with Nolan. I want to say maybe a week before we graduated.
Yeah.
There's a conversation that's had within a black household from birth, and this is who you are. You're black. You're gonna. I won't say this for every household, but the majority of the households, if you grew up in a black household, this is what you'll hear. You're different. That's off the bat. You're different. You don't look like everybody else. You have to learn to accept that. Some don't accept that. Some do, and you live your life accordingly. Mm-hmm. But in terms of police and how they are supposed to serve and protect, our conversation with our parents and our grandparents and anybody that we're related to, it isn't, oh, look at your local police officer, he's here to serve and protect you. Our conversation is, when you see him, make sure you're doing everything the right way, make sure you're conducting yourself appropriately, which I don't think that's bad, because they're telling us
I feel like
the
that's
right
something
things.
that my parents told me too.
Yeah, and that is something that
don't mess around with a police officer. When he pulls you over, follow what he says.
Yeah.
But I think that the conversation definitely differs between black families and white families.
It does, because our conversation might be the same. Ours is out of fear of so and so is going to happen because it happened to your cousin last week, or happened to, maybe you're not related to Trayvon Martin, but it happened to him.
Yeah.
So I think that probably comes from generations of a time period where your parents, maybe your grandparents, grew up in an era, say in a city or something, where they had to fear that police were going to be abusive. We've seen in the past that 1960, there were people that were still racist. Jim Crow still existed, and there was still a large amount of division between black and white, especially within the police force, and you've seen it in movies, you've seen it everywhere. It's published, it's imprinted in our history, and it's something that parents teach their kids when they grow up.
It's something that's imprinted in our history, but today in 2018, we legitimately do not have any statistical merit that the police force in the United States in 2018 is actually racist. And so it's this narrative that's pushed by the left, that's pushed by the Democratic Party onto black Americans. And we see that black families are legitimately teaching their kids out of fear to be safe around police officers. That police officers aren't necessarily there to serve or protect you, but that you should legitimately be scared of police officers. And when you see them, you should kind of be scared for your life because of the color of your skin.
Well, I think that because the same narrative is for when a white person walks down the street and sees a black person. There's times in America, I would say, if you talk to white people and they're walking on the same side of the street as a black person, this is my perspective at least, from the community I've seen of people, is that they'll be scared of a black person.
This is what, I've really thought about this one a lot, this idea of unconscious bias.
Yeah.
So when I think about it, and let's say I'm at Walmart at like 3 a.m, okay? A black guy comes in with like his hood up, right? Like I'm gonna be kind of scared. Like I'm alone in Walmart and this dude comes in with his hood up, but I would be just as scared if a white guy came in with his hood up. Like, would you be more scared if you saw this threatening white guy with like his hood up, or would you be more scared if a black guy walked into Walmart wearing a tuxedo? Like, it's legitimately how their character is presented and not necessarily the color of their skin.
This is something that Mark Cuban, who's the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, said about 5-6 years ago. He said something along the lines that if a black man with a hoodie is walking like on the same sidewalk as him, he's going to walk to the other side of the street. He's also going to walk to the other side of the street when a white man with tattoos all over him is walking across
It's not
the street.
necessarily the color of their skin, it's the character that they're presenting
It's
themselves.
the appearance that they're presenting themselves.
But even in that, though, that bias, I don't think is necessarily justified. I don't think that that's a justifiable bias.
I think that
over appearance.
I would agree with you. I'm just saying it's not necessarily racist to be biased when you see somebody and judging on their look and not necessarily you're judging on their look and not necessarily the color of their skin. I feel like the unconscious bias is how they look, what they're wearing, what tattoos they have, what piercings they have, and not necessarily what their skin color is.
I still think that there's an inherent bias that that people get from this situation. I don't know. Like, what
all right, this is what I'll say. So I had a conversation with an assistant public defender. Her name is Judy Cullenberg. She works for Kane County as well as Kendall County here and there. But she's been in multiple courtrooms, multiple hearing cases, mostly civil cases. And she has found through her research and, throughout the different cases that she's had, is there is a bias within the courtrooms and even outside in the streets, just your local police officer patrolling the streets. She told me from her personal experience that the culture is to target minorities. Now, when I heard this, I was surprised. I was surprised and I wasn't surprised at the same time, but I asked her, I said, so why do you think that is? She said it's just something that they do. And then, it translates. And that's why there's more evidence to back up, because you're mentioning the statistics and what do the statistics show? Well, the statistics might not date back so far as to why it's just the black people, but if you look at current times, it's just, I look at it more of a it is what it is type thing. Like, it's happening, and what can we do to change it? So, I don't know.
It might not just be that you could say that cops are racist, because I acknowledge that most cops aren't racist. They're not going to target people just because of their race, but it's the way that the state is set up. It's the way that cities are set up. It's gone back to the 1960s when white flight happened, mm-hmm. and when all of the whites went to the suburbs and blacks were left in the inner city with terrible conditions. I've talked about this time after time to you, where you go through a city today and there's a factory with abandoned factories, abandoned warehouses, abandoned trains.
That Chicago, you see that in Detroit.
You see that in Detroit, you see it in Chicago, you see it everywhere where white flight happened,
mm-hmm.
and industry's gone. And in those regions, crime just has moved in and has really taken over the area. Whether it's gang violence, whether it's black on black crime, anything like that. It's taken over.
Again,
It's
this
controlled.
is one of the solutions is to
controlled
get
area.
bigger businesses into these cities.